folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to pick up where we left off last week with a process for building a feature. So when we last spoke, what we were focused on is taking a look at my process for building a feature inside of a product completely from scratch. So if you've been following along with these Feature Friday videos, typically I've already implemented a feature or I've already completely built it to the point where you're not really seeing from like first thought all the way through to the end of the feature being implemented, how do I do it? And so that's what this kind of, I guess we call it a mini series is about. I think we'll finish up in this video or maybe one future video. But the point of this is to teach you how to think about implementing a feature. So when I say how to think, what I'm not talking about is the technical stuff. So I'll give you some technical hints just like I did in the last video, but this is less about the code stuff and more about like, well, how do you actually reason about building a feature? And so the reason for that is that that's where I see most people get stuck. I mean, a lot of people who are really, really good with code, but they struggle with the conceptual side of things, like how do I put it together? And I want to show you through these videos that it literally is just a step-by-step thing. It's not magic. You know, there's no like, there's nothing special going on here. It's one, it comes down to experience, so you have to put in the time and keep trying this again and again and again. So the only reason I've gotten to the point where I've gotten is because I've done this for a very long time, and I've struggled through this for a very long time. So I want to make sure that that's abundantly clear before we move further here is what you're seeing is the end result of several years focused on just trying and building stuff. So again, if you've been following my work or you've been watching these videos or reading tutorials or if you heard about the Meteor Chef or anything I've done in the past, you'll know that if you go back and look, it's all been very slow. It was an evolution. So it was, I got to learn how to do this, and then I got to learn how to do this, and then I got to learn how to do this. And the real secret to all of it is just patience. It's not anything more than that. And so hopefully as you watch this video, and if you haven't seen the first part of this, I'll link it below so you can go back and watch that. What you're getting to see is how I actually reason through a problem and get it converted into a solution in the form of a feature. So that's what I'm trying to teach you in these videos. So if you're more on the code side and you think this is ridiculous, you may as well turn this off now because it's going to be a lot of me just kind of rambling and talking through like, well, here's why I did this or here's how I did this. So the first thing you'll notice if you watch the first video is that the UI for command has changed a little bit. It looks more dramatic than the actual change was. So the only thing I did was I had a little bit of a brainwave last weekend and I said, you know what, I want to change the overall framing for content on the pages. So if I jump down here, I've got cards and versions. None of this stuff has changed. The actual features are exactly the same. I've just changed the wrapper that's outside of them. And the reason why, you can kind of see it over here in the navigation, is now that I've got the fundamentals built for command, I'm starting to think about like, well, where do I want to take it long term? Like getting all the stuff out of my head. And this is part of building a feature. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see people making is they don't get stuff out of their heads. So when you're building a product, it's inevitable that you're going to have 10 million different ideas. And so this is especially true when I'm working with mentees at Clever Beagle. One of the things that I do is I say, do a brain dump. Get it out of your head. And the reason why is that it's very easy to keep all that stuff running through your head and you get distracted. So like if I didn't write any of this down, and writing down, so I'm going to use that phrase, I say writing down. Sometimes I literally mean opening up a text document and writing stuff down. And other times I mean just like map out what you think this might look like later and design it in the browser. And don't worry about wasting your time. Just say, okay, well, where do I want to go? And the analogy that I've used before is, I haven't done this in a while, but if you've played any like RPG style video game, they always have this concept of you start at one small point and then as you walk, the map starts to reveal itself. And that's the way I like to think about designing a product or designing features inside of a product is I'm trying to explore and figure out like, well, where could this go? So whenever I make a change, like in this case, this navigation, I can't say 100% that this is exactly what I'm going to do or how I'm going to do it, but it's what's on my mind, or it's what was in my mind last week. So I was like, well, this resonates with the overall goal of what I want this product to be, which is it's an all-in-one solution for building a SaaS product. So I started to ask myself, like, well, okay, genius, what does that mean? Where is this going? And so I started to map it out so I could see it. And what this allows me to do is think a little bit further out about, like, well, not just what am I building, but what do I have to do? What is it? How is this? Does all this stuff fit together? Are you just a crazy person? Like, what are you doing? And so again, all I did last week was I just added this navigation. It's not functional. Like, it's kind of functional, but like, it doesn't link to anything. So I can click on these, but it's not going anywhere. It's just for me to sit here and reason about, like, how do I want this to work, and how do I want it to work from the customer's perspective. So you remember, if you watched the last video, I talked a lot about working backwards from the customer experience. This is it. So I'm not working on data models for this inbox feature. I'm focused on what is it going to look like as a user to use this, and is it going to make sense? And so that's something to keep in mind as you're building your own product is, what's it going to feel like? What's it going to look like? Does it make sense? And not just bullshitting yourself, but actually being honest and saying, like, okay, if I put all these together and label them in this way and organize it this way, does it make sense? So something to consider. So shifting back to what we were focused on in the last video, we were talking about this revenue feature. So if you don't remember, what I did was I showed you a mock-up I had done inside of a program called Sketch. It's just a design program. And I took that sketch and I converted it to some markup in the form of React components. So I built the design inside of a rough version of the design inside of the browser and made it a little bit functional. So I didn't wire it up to a database. We didn't talk about data models or anything like that. All I did was I focused on getting that customer experience in the browser. I wanted to see, what's this going to feel like, or how is this going to work? And so now, and this has been over the past week, my focus has been on, okay, well, what is the next step? Like, what, in order to make that chart work that we saw on screen, how do I actually do that? Like, what do I need? What are the parts that I need? So one kind of concept that I use, I don't actively call it this or think about it like this, but it's pretty much what's going on, is I think about, before I actually start to implement something, what I'll do is I'll say, like, well, what's the shopping list, or what's the grocery list? And so I know I'm going to have to do certain things. So what I do is I think those out ahead of time. So I rarely will start to develop, especially a big feature, by just starting to write code kind of blindly. I'll always think, even for a few minutes, what are the steps involved here? And you'll hear me say that. So if you ever work with me one-on-one, you'll hear me say that constantly. What are the steps? What are the steps? Almost to the point of nausea. So in this case, I knew that, okay, I want to get a chart on screen, and that chart is going to have revenue data. And so the next question was, well, where's that revenue data coming from? And so this is when I started to think about the grocery list. It was, well, that data is going to come from third-party providers. Okay, what does that mean? And then here's the start of the list. It's, well, you have to get a connection to those third-party providers as your user, as your customer. Okay, that's one item on the list. And then what? Well, once you have that connection, then you need to sync their data. Okay, that's one item on the list. And then the third is, well, what data do you need to sync? And so that's the next item on the list. And basically what I do, and this list is ever growing, so it's pretty much impossible to think about every single detail up front, but you can think about a handful of them. And so that's usually what I do, and in this case, that's exactly what I did. So I said, well, I know that Stripe is going to be the first payments provider that I want to work with. Okay. So my first question was, well, how do I get access to another user's account? And so I've been vaguely familiar with Stripe Connect. So this is a product that Stripe offers. And basically, it's just a fancy version of an OAuth connection back to Stripe's data on the behalf of your customers. So they have a lot of different features. So you can do like a payments platform. So if you've ever worked with like a third-party site like a YouTube or something like that, where you have an advertising model and you collect revenue on behalf of your customers, and then at some future date you do a payout. Stripe Connect helps you do stuff like that, but it also allows you to connect on behalf of a user and get access to their data, which is really helpful and is what I needed for this feature. So Stripe Connect is something that I was vaguely familiar with but didn't know much about. So the very first thing I did, or the first item on my list was, well, I need a connection to the account, so how do I do that? And so what I did was I Googled this. I literally said like Stripe OAuth connection or Stripe OAuth. And then I found this. So actually I did it this morning because I was kind of like, what the hell did I do? And I did this. So I said connect OAuth reference. And this is something that I see people struggle with, and it's important to keep in mind is you cannot get frustrated if you don't find exactly what you're looking for. You got to have fun in the process of building this stuff to say like, well, I'm like, okay, so I typed connect to Stripe OAuth, but maybe, I don't know, maybe I ended up on this page at first. And something I constantly see is people get angry or like this frustration when they don't immediately find the answer. And that can be frustrating, but the important part is like get comfortable with that. You're not always going to find it on the first go. You got to dig a little bit. And that's one of the dirty secrets about doing this stuff is the people who are going to be, or more likely to be successful, we'll put it that way, are the ones who don't quit and don't get frustrated by dumb little things. Like this is a dumb little thing. Like, oh, I didn't find it on the first one. Where is it? It's like, just chill. Like focus on, well, what am I looking for? And in this case, I know that I'm looking for a way to connect to accounts. And I know that OAuth is a way that I can do that. And if you haven't already watched it or you haven't been following along, I did a whole series, I want to say it was 4 or 5 videos on doing integration. So I talk a ton about OAuth, and I talk about the 2 different types of OAuth. So there's OAuth 1, OAuth 2, and I talk about both. So check that out if you haven't already. So I knew that, okay, I need an OAuth connection, and eventually by reading this, and I sat here and read this, I was like, yeah, this is what I want. And my first hint, and if you were watching those other videos, you'll recognize this too, is, oh, there's a redirect URI. Okay, that tells me that that's the URI I'm going to direct somebody to log them in via Stripe. Okay, now what that did, and this is where you have to really think. So the first thought that came to mind when I saw this, I've already done that. And I already did it from all that integrations work. And so I knew that like, well, the pattern's going to be the same. Again, OAuth is a standard, so I know that, oh, well, okay, I'm gonna redirect them to a page. That page is going to ask them for some permission. They're going to click a button. That page should redirect me back to a URL in my server, and then at that URL, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff to get an access token for the user and store it in the database. So what ended up happening was that was exactly the case. I literally copy and pasted, and let's see if we can find it. I'm trying to think of how I can get to that. We'll go to the function. So I've got this render connect payment processor. Let's see how I did it. Stripe connect button. This isn't the cleanest. This is one of those situations where you're like, how the hell did I do this? I went right past it. So I came up with this process because I know that eventually I'm going to support other payment processors. That doesn't come out. Payment processors. Payment processors. There we go. I knew that I'm going to connect other payment processors. There it is. And so I thought ahead, and this is something else that you can do while you're building features. Think ahead. So don't just build it for, like, if you know that the potential feature that you're working on could have different variations or different permutations of it, think about what those might be, and then before you actually implement something, consider, well, how can I design what I'm working on right now to make it more flexible to support those different versions. And so that's what I did here. As I said, well, I know that the first one I'm going to work on is Stripe, but let me design this as though it could be any payment processor. I'm done. I'm not even going to bother. We'll just say payment provider. There we go. That's a little better. So any payment provider, how do I design this so that I can basically just snap in the next part of the next provider without a lot of stress? And so we can see here that I took the exact same pattern that I used for the integrations. Literally, I copy and pasted this. So I said, well, I know that I'm going to connect to a service, and so I'm going to take this function, and that's going to allow me to talk to integration. And you'll notice, and I've linked the videos down below, so do take a look, because I've used the exact same structure, the exact same pattern. And I kind of hinted at this earlier. So the way that I do this is I stay consistent in every little detail that I'm working on. And this is like when most people are like, how did you build that so quickly? It's patterns. It's not magic. It's just patterns. So the idea is that, and I see this all the time, if you write a function to do something one way, always try and keep that function consistent when you adapt it in other ways. So in this case, and we can look at this. So let's see if we can find, what says product integrations, product settings integrations. Let's see if we can get it on here. Yes. So this handle connect to service, and we'll just kind of stare at it for a second, contemplate. Okay. Well, see, this is why I shouldn't be allowed to touch computers anymore. I don't understand them well enough. So over here on the right, we have the original integrations code. And over here on the left, we have the new Stripe stuff. And you'll notice, if I can kind of get them both on screen, they're more or less identical. And the reason why is the pattern is the same. So we talked about in the integrations video, I talked about having to use async await because the Twitter one, I had to go to the server and get some data to build the URL in the first place. So I realized, screw it, I'll just use a pattern of wrapping every single one of these with a promise. So each one of these on the right over here, I'm saying, okay, I'm just going to return a promise, even if I don't need to. So again, that's pattern thinking. So you're saying, well, I don't need to do this, but by doing this, I'm eliminating the extra thinking that my brain is going to have to do in order to solve this problem. I can just say, okay, all of them are consistent. I can trust that all of them work in the same way, so I don't have to think through, oh, well, crap, the Stripe one did it this way, the Twitter one did it doesn't matter. You're saying they're all trying to return, like in this case, they're all trying to return a string. One of them has to wait on a server response. So make all of them wait on a server response, even if they don't have it, and return a string. Done. And so now I don't have to think through it. And then when you get down to handle connect to service, the same exact structure. I know that, okay, the settings for that provider are going to be in the Meteor settings public integrations object. And I'd show you that, but it's got all my secret keys in it, so I'm not going to pull it up. But I put it in my public integrations object in my settings file, and then I pass the service name. That's it. So again, these are identical. Keep in mind that one is for GitHub, Twitter, and MailChimp, the other is for Stripe. But because I know, okay, they're both using OAuth to do this, well, screw it, I'll just use the same pattern. And so literally, step by step here, same exact pattern. And then instead of GitHub OAuth URL or something like that, I've got floating around here somewhere. My linter was yelling at me for how I organized my code. There it is. So get Stripe OAuth URL. And again, it returns a promise. And this is important. So you may say like, well, wait a minute. In this context, you don't have to have a promise. In this one, you didn't for some of them, and some of them you did. This is the point about the consistency. This pattern of connecting to a third-party provider now is being cemented into my head as this is how you do it. So from a maintenance perspective or a maintenance cost perspective, I don't have to worry about figuring out different patterns for the exact same thing. I know in my head, this is how I'm doing OAuth connections. That's it. And so now if I want to add other stuff later, or if I want to get rid of stuff, or if there's a bug that I have to fix, I know that regardless of where that bug happens, because this is dealing with OAuth connections, I'm following a pattern. That pattern is going to be consistent, and so I'm not going to have to rethink things. You may say, "But why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep? You're rambling." It's like I am rambling, and I'm making the point very clear. It's patterns, and I say it with that kind of tone because a lot of people are like, "Well, but what do you do?" Patterns, 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 patterns. patterns, 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 doilies, patterns, patterns, patterns. And I patiently await the white jackets. Send them along. Okay, so what I did is I figured out, okay, I'm following this pattern. I know that I have to get a connection to Stripe. So I set up my URL here, and basically what you saw is I wired it up to a button click, and that button click is this doodle. So if we go ahead and click this, I get redirected to the URL. And now I did a little bit of setup on Stripe for this. And this was also in the documentation. I forget exactly which file it was, but they walk you through, oh, you have to configure, you have to pass a logo, you have to give a name for the product, you have to make sure that you have access to certain features in their account, like you can toggle between different variations of Stripe Connect and stuff like that. So in between all this, I did stop at the Stripe dashboard and had to do some configuration. So I did that, and then once I got that working again, I knew that this pattern was the same, so I literally copied the code, tweaking the URL that Stripe wanted me to redirect to, and I was done. So that was it. So next, this is where things get a little more complicated. So I hit the connect button, and now, remember like earlier I talked about, well, I knew that Stripe was going to send a request back to my server at a specific URL, which is what technically just happened there. So if we go over to the code, the way that I've wired this up is this page, the revenue page, when it loads or when it mounts, I call to a GraphQL query. So what I decided was, well, in order to fetch the chart data, I'm going to have to run a query. But that query needs to be aware. So it needs to know, and this is when we're going back to the steps or the grocery list. So that query needs to be aware that I may or may not have a connection to a third-party provider. So it needs to make a decision. It needs to say, well, you either have a third-party account to pull data from or you don't. And so that was the next point for my thinking is like, well, okay, what does that mean? And so again, patterns. So you'll notice I'm using what I call the action pattern. So if you haven't checked this out before, or you haven't seen this in any of the videos, I've linked an article down below that I wrote detailing step by step how this thing works. So again, patterns. You're gonna really hate that word at the end of this video. So the pattern here is that, well, I have a process called get revenue. I need to get revenue data. I'm getting the revenue data. So the very first thing that I thought, and this was the very first thing, so I actually started to map out this module, and what I did, and you'll notice that everything's got a very clear name about what's going on here. So the idea is that this function, get revenue, is going to be called by my query, and then it's going to perform a series of steps. So again, the list. So this is another one. I might have mentioned this in the last video, but another way that I think about building features is I have a lot of shortcuts. So if you've never, in your text editor, written any snippets or anything like that, do it. Spend an hour, spend 2 hours, however long it takes you to unpack those common patterns that you use over and over into snippets. So I want to say snippets, yeah, configure user snippets. So I have a massive and ever-growing file of snippets of common patterns that I use over and over. So you'll notice here, this one is act test. So that's what I type into the text editor to get it to spit out that snippet. But this is a pattern that I use for writing my test for actions. And then somewhere around here, there's going to be an action pattern. I'm looking right at it. So this is an action when I use a promise. This is, I'm guessing this is an action when I don't use a promise. Yes. So this requires a little bit of discipline. You got to take the time to say, okay, well, and pay attention. You can't just goof off. You got to say, like, well, what's the stuff that I'm constantly doing? And more importantly, the stuff that I'm constantly doing, I always do it the exact same way, except I'm usually having to do it from memory. I'm having to remember what exactly I typed, or I copy and paste from another file. Think about those things, figure out what they are, and then go and copy them. And then the website that I like to use for this is snippet-generator.app. So they have the 3 major text editors, so hopefully you're in there. If you're a Vim person, then you'll know about, I think they call it key bindings or something like that, but you'll know roughly where I'm getting with this, or where I'm headed with this. So what I do is I type in a description of what it is, and like we saw, I think it was called act test. So I type in my snippet here. So what I'll do is I'll paste, and let's see, have I written any of these tests yet? No. So let's go to, I want to say I have customers. Yeah. So when I recognize a pattern, so we'll say that for whatever reason I've never written a test for an action before. Well, I know I've got at least one. So I'm going to copy that one, and I'm going to take it over to here. And now I'm going to, and I do take the time to do this. So you might be like, oh, I don't want to take the time to do that. It's like, well, you don't deserve what you want then. You got to take the time to do this shit properly. End of story. So what I'll do is I'll just go through and I'll say, like, well, I know that I'm not going to have customers in every single one, but I'm going to probably have some database collection that I need to talk to. So I'll generalize that. And then this, I know, is the action that I'm testing. So I'm going to say action. And so what I'm doing is I'm creating a consistent pattern for myself to follow, a template, if you will. So I'm not saying anything. So like here, I know that, okay, well, I'll probably pass a user ID. So I have an options object, and we'll say, here I'm saying describe, and then in this case, my action name. So action name.js. So that's the name of my action. That's what I'm testing. And then in here, I have some before each stuff. So what I'll usually do is I'll do something like collection. And again, we're just trying to generalize it. We're not trying to make it perfect. We're just trying to give ourselves patterns to follow and examples so that when we go to use this stuff, it works. And so if I was doing this for real, I would literally step through this and try and, the word that came to mind was generify, but I know that's not a word. But I'm trying to make it generic. I'm trying to make it generic enough where I could go and pop in any action-related code and test it. That's the point. So back over in Get Revenue, thinking through these steps. So again, this action pattern, what I'm doing is I'm saying, well, I have to perform certain steps in order to get where I want. And so I know that, well, and this you'll see. So I kind of started to write this, and then I went on a rant about snippets. So the to-do thing is something I'll do constantly before I actually write code. So this is my TDML snippet. Sometimes my snippets are a little clunky. There we go. So what I'll do is I'll just sit here and write a list. Literally, before I write any code, I'll just write a list. Like, what do I need to do? And actually force myself to think through the problem. It's like, well, I'm getting revenue. How do I get the revenue? Well, what was the last thing we just did? That's super important. So we connected to Stripe. Well, in order to get revenue, I need to have a connection to Stripe. Okay, I just got the data from Stripe. Where did I get that data, or where did I put that data from Stripe? Meaning the connection to the user Stripe account. I put that on the product, didn't I? I did. Okay, get the product. So that's a step. And so I know that this is informing a lot of stuff. So when this starts, I have my pattern. So let's look at a fresh file here. So if I do, I think there's a promise action. If I do that, and let's turn on JavaScript. So right here, you'll notice that when this pattern spits out for the first time, I just have option, some option as a placeholder. And so what I'm doing when I work through this list is I'm thinking about, like, okay, well, get product with product ID. What product ID? Oh, well, back in my UI, I'm looking at a product right now. Where does that product ID come from? The URL. Okay, so now I'm starting to tell myself what are the data requirements for this. Keep in mind, I'm not trying to figure everything out ahead of time. I'm just thinking in steps. I'm saying, like, well, what am I going to need at this point in time? Not trying to force myself like, oh God, what is everything that I need to have? I'm saying, like, well, what's the one thing I need at this step? So in this case, get product with product ID. And so what this tells me, so if I was to write this from scratch, I would just say, okay, well, I know that I'm going to need the product ID as an option. I don't have a choice, so I'm going to add that in. I'm going to say throw new error if you don't have, so options.product ID, I think that's what I had, is required. And I'll literally, at that time, I'll say, like, okay, that's a requirement. And specifically, this pattern is designed to help me build the feature. So you'll notice that the very first thing that I do is I call validate options. And so what I'm doing with that is I'm telling myself, hey dummy, here's what you said you needed for this feature. And so I literally type these things in up here, because later when I go to call this function or call this action, what's going to happen is if I forget, it's going to throw an error. It's going to say, that's required. And so typically when we think about validation, we're thinking about validating user input, but a real boon on progress for yourself and just making things speed up is to validate yourself. So check yourself. Don't assume that you're some like evil genius. Say like, no, I'm kind of an idiot and I'm going to screw this up. So let me bake things into my code that are going to tell me I'm being an idiot, so I don't have to sit and wonder like later when I call get product and I pass this and it doesn't work and I can't figure out why. I've already told myself. I know like, oh, I just forgot something. Simple, easy. So back down here, we're saying get product with product ID. That told us one of our dependencies for this action. It's, oh, well, we need a product ID past this an option. Cool. So then the next thing is, okay, well, we have the product, and the reason we got that is so we could get the payment. I'm going to try it. Payment processors. Payment processor. There we go. Payment provider, whatever you want to call it. We need to get that payment provider from the product. So, okay, in theory, we have the product. So then the next step is get credentials for payment processor. Can't believe I'm having that much time with that word. Okay, so get credentials for payment processor. And I'm spelling, am I spelling it right? Processor, yeah, okay. Get credentials for payment processor. I hope you're enjoying this. Okay, so that's our next step. We've got the product, then we need to get the credentials for payment processor, and I should say for payment processor from it's not coming out. It's just not happening. I'm not doing that on purpose. Okay, so once we have that, so now we're at a point where we're saying get our product, get the credentials. Now we have the credentials, and then we get into the next step. So it's, well, okay, great. We have the user's credentials. What do we do with those? And now we have to make a decision, and this is where you have to think. So usually people get frustrated with me right about this point when I'm mentoring them, which is I'll say, well, this is where you have to think through the problem. It's not magic in the sense that every single feature anyone ever builds is going to operate in the exact same way. You have to think about, in the context of this specific feature, how is this one going to work? So, and this, I literally spent, good Lord, probably an hour and a half, 2 hours, just figuring out this one point. So literally, this code right here, 2 hours. And the reason why is, and this is what's going to separate you and your product from the rest of the pack, which is, if you think about things up front in detail, and you take the time to do them right, you're not going to have to come back and fix it later. And if you've never heard of him, I highly recommend. He kind of pisses people off. He's a little salty, but he's brilliant. There's a guy named Bob Martiner. He goes by Uncle Bob. And he runs an excellent series of tutorials called Clean Coders. And so Clean Coders just teaches you how to write clean code and just different philosophies. And the videos are pretty fun. He's kind of a silly guy, so he brings some fun to what is otherwise kind of a boring topic. So what he talks about a lot is that rushing makes messes, or taking the time to do things right now, which seems like you're going slower, actually speeds you up later. And at first, when I first heard that from him, I thought he was full of shit. I said, no, that can't be possible. I'm spending all this time writing tests and taking my time with code and thinking very carefully about how I design things. That's taking a long time. I'm just going to rush through this and build it. And I've spent more time than I'd like to admit of my life debugging code that I wrote in a rush trying to solve a problem, but didn't think it through, and then I had to spend more time later to come back and fix it. And that cycle repeated in my life for years. I would rush through stuff, it would break, predictably, and then because it was usually something that was customer facing, I had to panic, stop whatever I was doing that day, go fix that stuff, and then that stuff would get fixed, and then I'd kind of go back to what I was doing, and it was just this horrible cycle. And so what I realized, I listened to him. I said, you know what? He's right. Take the time to do it correctly the first time, and then later you're not coming back. Unless it's some really weird edge case. You know, but you know what I'm talking about. So like runtime errors where it's like you didn't do, I don't know, so say you had a variable, like we'll say some variable, and you do something like this. So you're trying to pull a property off an object. So we'll say some object dot, I don't know, we'll say cheese. And so this code runs, and then in one of the cases, some object doesn't exist. And this is a very easy bug to fix. You just say, well, if some object exists, try and get to cheese. There's a bunch of different ways to do that, but the point I'm making is when you go slow, you catch those sorts of details up front. You don't have to let it happen in production and then, you know, kick yourself in the ass later when you're like, oh, wow, I could have gotten that right the first time. So that's the point being made here. So I don't get frustrated when this little bit of code took me 2 hours. The reason why is I know that shit works, and it really works. And there's only going to be extreme edge cases, like I was saying, where that's going to fail. And so now I'm comfortable saying, like, well, now I can trust that this code will work up to or maybe even beyond those edge cases, and I don't have to stress about it. And so again, doesn't matter how much you write in how little of time, it's more so, is the quality of what you're writing going to solve the problem in a way that prevents it from breaking unnecessarily because you rushed and you made a bunch of messes. So keep that in mind. So the next thing that I did in this flow, and I'm starting to realize we may need to do another video here because hopefully this is helpful, but it is taking a while and I do got to take off. So what I'm saying is I've got my payment processor, payment provider. I gotta get used to saying that instead. So I've got my payment provider. And side note, this is kind of a hint toward like naming things a certain way, so it's not such a pain in the ass to trip over them. So I've got my payment provider. There it is. And now I have to make a decision. And this is what I was talking about a little bit ago. You have to think through the problem carefully. So there's going to be two states for any customer that I'm working with. They've either connected the payment provider and they fetch data from that provider, or they haven't. So, and this is where you get into experience stuff. So you're not going to always get this right the first time. You got to get comfortable with getting it done and letting it be kind of the implementation not being perfect. And again, I'm not talking about perfect in the sense of like taking your time and doing it right. Basically what I'm saying is doing it right up to the limits of your own personal knowledge. And so what I knew by going through this process is, well, in order for me to do the calculations I need for those charts, I have to have data from Stripe. That's going to be potentially a lot of data. And so I realized, well, I don't want to have to make a trip to Stripe every single time somebody loads this page. This thing's not going to work. It's just going to basically be dead in the water. It's going to take forever to load. So I said, well, how do you get around that? Well, I have to cache it. And by cache, I mean literally store data in my local database as opposed to doing a network request to go and get it. So I said, well, okay, there's a theory. You're going to have to go to Stripe and get some data, cache it in your database, and then do your calculations against that cached copy. Okay, that sounds plausible. So this is where I started to experiment. So again, at this point, I wasn't concerned about just getting it right on the first swing. It was, let's try this. And so that's another part of my process for building a feature is what might work, or what is my hypothesis that I think will work. So again, like we talked about this in the first video, I'm pretty sure. I talked about like me building a feature. The feature itself is a hypothesis when I start. So I'm saying, I think this is what people need. I think this is solving a problem. In the same exact way at the code level, you want to think like, well, I think that this is how this problem needs to be solved. So in this case, I think that what I need to do is cache data from Stripe in my database. Okay, so what I don't do is worry. So I see a lot of people worry and panic like, well, but what if I waste time doing that? What if that's not the right thing? One, grow up. Two, that's a good thing. Because even if you go down that road and it doesn't work out, you just learned something. You learned whatever that pattern was or whatever that technique was that you were using, but you also learned that that wasn't the answer. So it's a bit trite, but you know, the whole, I forget what the number was, but Thomas Edison, before he got the light bulb, it was like thousands or something, like hundreds or thousands of attempts. And that's why he got to be Thomas Edison and other people didn't, is because he sat there and, you know, he fucked with the light bulb until it's like, oh, okay, now it does what I want it to do. This is the exact same thing. You have to kind of deal with that, like, well, it's not going to always work perfectly. And once you internalize that, it gets a lot easier to kill 2 hours working on something like this. And even if it doesn't work out exactly how you expect, you still realize that, like, well, nothing bad happened. I got better at my craft. I'm better at doing what I do. So, you know, who cares? And that's something important, because I do see that habit a lot in people, is they get frustrated about not getting it right the first time or it taking too long. It's like, it's going to take forever to do it right. Get over it. And this helps me. So even though I'm not, something that I keep in mind is act as if. So I act as if I'm designing this software for doctors, or I act as if I'm designing something that's launching humans into space. And I don't, like, not literally, so not in the sense that, like, what I'm building is for that purpose, but I think about it with that level of seriousness. So even though, like, yeah, generating chart data, if that screws up, nobody's going to die. But I act as if somebody might die if I screw this up. And so keeping that kind of idea in my head while I'm doing this stuff, it slows me down. It forces me to think through the problems in a way that I would have to, and I literally would not have a choice if I was building, like, the software that was going into a robot that was going to perform heart surgery. Like, can't fuck that up. Or like the big one that's been happening a lot lately, all of these driverless cars. They're having to build that software. Like, you see what the end result is when you screw it up. So if you take the level of seriousness of, and the airplanes and all that, man, that's kind of upsetting. But keep that sort of level of seriousness at your work or into your work, and you're going to get better results just by default. You're not going to act as though, oh, well, it's not a big deal if it breaks. It's not the end of the world. It's like, you can live your life like that, but you're not going to be happy with the end result of that long term. So if you ever are kind of stuck and you're wondering, like, well, how do I do this like those guys, assuming those guys are like the top of the top, this is how you do it. You have to take your time. You have to be deliberate. You have to be patient about what you're doing. So once I've gotten up to this point, I know that, well, there's potentially a lot of weight to this, or this could be very performance heavy. So that's more likely the phrase that you'll hear is performance heavy, or it's going to put a load on performance, and that's true. So what I realized when I started to do this, and one of the things that I did, because my first question was, okay, I need to figure out, well, what exactly am I pulling from Stripe? What data do I need? This took me 2 days. So I literally, I thought it was going to be one thing. It wasn't that thing, because I tested it out. Then I tried another thing. That wasn't it. And then it ended up being a third thing. And the third thing was events. So what I realized was, in order to get accurate data over time, I needed to know exactly when things were happening. And just based on the shape of Stripe's data, I knew that, well, the only way I can guarantee I know exactly what the state of affairs was at a given point in time is based on events. And if you're saying, like, holy shit, this is hard, it's like, yes, that's the point. I didn't start out doing this stuff. So I started out building very simple CRUD apps, right to a database. Click this button, it does that thing. Sends an email, does whatever. You build toward this stuff. So if this is intimidating or you're like, I can't do that, the best attitude you can adopt for learning how to do this stuff is, I can't do that right now, but I can get there. And so if you focus on that, and you can push yourself too. There's definitely stuff, like, in retrospect, where I wish I would have pushed myself and tried some harder problems, because I may not have solved them correctly, but I could have at least developed a better understanding a little bit faster. So food for thought. So with this event stuff, I realized, okay, that's going to have all the information that I need in order to solve this problem. And so the next immediate thought was, Holy crap, that's a lot. Because events happen constantly inside of Stripe, meaning every time something happens, they're generating an event record. And so thinking back, like, well, this is a business tool, so you're going to have to make decisions based on current data as well as past data, which means I needed to fetch every single event that happened since the beginning of that person's account up to today, and then everything past today too. And so that's a lot of stuff. And so what I realized was, well, that's going to take some time. That's going to take some effort. And if you've never done it before, one of the best things you can do to buffer performance, and a lot of people use this. This is big at companies like Twitter or Facebook, where there's a lot of user data coming in. Excuse me. Is you buffer things by using a queue. So a queue is literally what it sounds like. You're putting tasks in line to be executed at a future time as soon as resources are available. And so what I decided for this was, well, realistically up front, there's probably not going to be a ton of people doing these imports, but at a future date there could be. So I decided, well, let's buffer this import process with a queue. So the first thing I thought was, well, and the next thing I thought was, okay, well, I'm already using a queue for something else. What am I using that queue for? And then I realized, like, oh, I'm doing it in my webhooks. So again, patterns. This is the same stuff over and over. I've already done this, so don't rethink it again. Just say, like, reuse that pattern. So back over here, whenever I get a webhook, and a webhook is when I'm working with a third-party service and some event happens on their end, they're going to send me an event or send me a message, which gets called a webhook. They're going to send me a webhook, and I can react to that webhook if I want. Problem with webhooks is there's a bunch of them, and they can constantly flood into your application. You can't control when they're going to show up or how many are going to show up. You don't technically know. So you have to be prepared for anything. And so when I was building the webhooks integration for all of the third-party integrations, so the stuff like GitHub, MailChimp, and Twitter, this is primarily used for GitHub. What I said was, well, I'm going to need a queue. I'm going to need a way to take in those webhooks without having to process it. That word is not coming out today. Without having to process them exactly at that point in time. And so what I said was, well, I can put them in a queue, and then I'll let the queue take it over. The reason I'm explaining this is, you'll notice here, this code, this is specific to, and you can see the only one I do have is handling the GitHub webhooks. So you can see that what I'm doing here is identical to here. So this is queue payment processor import. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I need to queue that up. The technical details don't matter that much. The point, though, is how I thought about this. So it's thinking about, like, well, what could potentially happen in the future, and how can I buffer against that breaking stuff? Again, that's more experiential. So you're not always going to get this right, but you have to go in with that understanding that, like, I'm not going to get this right. But that's okay. You gotta go through those phases of your personal development as a developer or programmer in order to get to the point where you realize, oh, yeah, I'm going to want to use a queue for that. Basically what I'm getting at is, it's very valuable to put yourself into situations where things break, because then it forces you to fix them. And after you do that so many times, you're going to just instantly come up with solutions like this, because you've had to deal with the fallout of those other problems. And you can't get frustrated by having to put in your dues. So that's another problem I see, is a lot of folks will just expect, like, well, you already know the answer, so just tell me. And I can tell you the answer. Like, I'm telling you right now. I'm not hiding this from you. But, and you'll probably notice this if you're not experienced with this stuff, you don't understand it. You may not understand why. And I can sit here and step through and tell you why, but there's still that wiring missing in your head. And the missing wire, if I had to take a guess, I don't know anything about this stuff, is you didn't experience the pain that triggered the requirement for this to exist in the first place. So you don't understand, like, why is that so significant, or why is that so important? And once you understand that stuff, it makes what you're doing a lot more meaningful and a lot easier to come up with these solutions, because you're not having to wonder like, oh, well, this guy told me to do this. I guess I'll just do it. It's in there. But you don't actually know, like, well, why did I just do that? And that's usually when you still have learning to do, is when you don't know the why of why you're doing it. So I think I'm going to stop here because I've noticed I've kind of gone into a lot of details here. But again, this actually makes sense. So we've only covered up to this point, except this took us, I think I've been going for 30 or 40 minutes here. But that's kind of the point, is that we took our time getting to here. I'm not rushing through this just to meet some arbitrary deadline. Like, I've got to go in a few minutes. I literally got to go teach somebody in a few minutes. I'm not rushing. I'm just saying, okay, this is where I got for today. That's okay. If somebody gets upset, they probably have some growing up to do. So we're just going to put this down here, and then I'll come back to it. And here's something that I like to do. So I always give myself a starting point, so I don't have to think about, like, well, what was I doing? So we'll say to do, and we're going to say, explain that the queue was set up to buffer lots of traffic. Need to explain how we get the data, or how we get the chart data once we format it, or once we, how we get the chart data once we've synced with Stripe. Okay, so the point of this, I don't really need to do that. I'll be able to remember this just by watching the video. But the point is, that's literally what I do when I have to go off to something else for my day. So that's another complaint that I hear a lot, is like, well, I don't have time to do this. You do. It just has to, it sucks. Like, the first few years that I did this, the overwhelming majority, I would say 85 to 95% of my time was spent on other people's stuff. But there was 5% that I had for myself. So in that 5%, even if that 5% was 30 minutes or an hour, I sat down and tried to figure something out. And this is how you can help yourself to keep some linearity to what you're doing, is even if you have an hour, do what you can in that hour, and then right before you stop, leave yourself a note. Tell yourself, okay, this is what I need to do next. This is the next problem or thing that I have to solve. And then that's it. And you got to just let it go. But over time, as you get better and better, you'll be, if you think, you got to think. But if you think, you'll be able to scoop back some of that time for yourself. You'll say, oh, well, I don't need to spend 85 to 95%. I only need to spend 80% now. Now 85%, or now I'm going backwards, 80%, 75%, 70%. And then over time, you get to a point where you just naturally can work more on your own stuff. But you gotta, it's deliberate, and you gotta take your time, you gotta be patient. Again, I've been doing professionally this stuff for 8 years, and I started learning it, like the nuts and bolts of front-end development, I think it was 11 or 12 years ago now. So this isn't short, this isn't quick. But holy hell, are the fruits great once you get past that proving ground. So if you're willing to do that, you'll go far. So that's going to do it for this episode of Feature Friday, folks. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below, and also hit the bell right next to it if you want to get notifications as soon as these are published. So signing off for the HMS Beagle, I'll see you next week.